This behind me is Tower Bridge, or is it London Bridge? Lots of people get the two confused. You're not going to make that mistake though after watching this video. Let's go walking history again along the banks of the Thames. Hi guys, welcome back to the Walking History YouTube channel with me, Mick Priestley, historian and walking tour guide here in central London. It's another lovely night here on the banks of the River Thames, which is of course the longest river that flows just through England at 215 miles long. The river is crossed by 138 bridges in total, but this one here is of course the most recognisable out of all of them. This is Tower Bridge, surely the most famous bridge in the world, with an honorary mention going to the Golden Gate Bridge out in San Francisco. Tower Bridge was built between 1886 and 1894 by two men, a man named John Barry and a man named Henry Brunel. Henry Brunel was the son of legendary architect Isambard Kingdom Brunel, who built, among other things, the Clifton Suspension Bridge in Bristol, which at 245 feet across the River Avon was the highest and most spectacular bridge in the country at the time, although he did actually die before he got to finish that. But Tower Bridge here stretches from Tower Hamlets on that side to Southwark on this side. It is exactly 800 feet long. It is 213 feet high, and it is in fact a combination suspension and double-leafed bascule bridge that rises in the middle when necessary to allow the boats and ships to pass through underneath. Each of the bascules, the two parts of the road that rise up like that, weigh more than 1,100 tons each, and it takes a full 5 minutes to lift them fully into position. But the bridge is made of 11,000 tons of steel, 70,000 tons of concrete, 31 million bricks and more than 2 million rivets. And when it was first unveiled here in 1894, it was originally painted brown. It stayed brown for a full 83 years after it was opened, right up until 1977, when it was finally painted red, white and blue like we see it today to celebrate the Silver Jubilee of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. The colour scheme was just that popular that they've kept it that way ever since. Today, the bridge now raises twice a day on average, and when it does do that, all of the traffic on the bridge and in the roads around has to come to a complete stop, because in this exact area of the city, for hundreds of years, boats and ships sailing up the river always have right of way. After just taking a short walk down the riverside here, we've now arrived at London Bridge. Not to be confused with Tower Bridge, London Bridge here was built in 1968, but there's been a bridge standing here for some 2,000 years. If we head just down here, we'll get exactly to the site of the original. Okay, so this behind me is the exact site of the original London Bridge, and the first mention of a bridge here actually seems to come from the year 43. Back in the year 43, there are documents that talk of a bridge here, or a London Bridge, but it seems to have been just a temporary structure with a number of boats anchored in the water here with some wooden beams and boards nailed across the top. Probably a bit wobbly if you walked across it, but that was London Bridge back in the year 43. Whatever happened to that bridge though for more than 900 years afterwards is kind of forgotten to history, because there don't seem to be any documents mentioning it again until we finally get to the year 984, and even then it's only mentioned in a criminal record. The criminal record of 984 states that after being accused of sticking pins into the image of a man, a woman and a son were arrested on suspicion of witchcraft before the woman was then drowned here at London Bridge while the son managed to escape. The bridge though, in that horrible story, was actually described as a wooden one, but once we got to the late 1100s, we then had the first substantial stone bridge built here, with 20 stone arches passing from this side to the other. There also used to be a wooden drawbridge in the middle, kind of like a very early tower bridge, that could be raised in the middle when necessary to allow the boats and ships to pass through. It also worked though as a secondary security feature, because if you had a rampaging mob of rebels attempting to storm into the city of London, you could raise the drawbridge in the middle and it would stop them being able to get across the river. But once we got to the early 1200s though, people then started building on the bridge. The deck of the bridge, the roadway, was around 20 feet wide, with a big wide path on either side. Any number of houses, tenements, warehouses, shops actually stood here on the bridge, and it became an inhabited bridge, and everything was just great. But there are of course some horrible things that have happened here as well. The 10th of July 1212 Great Fire of Southwark actually burned hundreds of people alive here on London Bridge. When the fire set fire to the buildings and trapped everybody on the structure, the bridge of course survived because it was made out of stone, but something else that survived was the stone gatehouse of London Bridge that also used to stand here, and it is upon the stone gatehouse of London Bridge that the severed heads of traitors were displayed. This is where Simon of Sudbury's head was placed after his horrible murder over on Tower Hill back in 1381. It's also where the head of William Wallace of Braveheart fame was placed before that in 1305. It's also where the head of Oliver Cromwell was placed, among others, in the 1660s, following the horrors of the English Civil War. Now, with the English Civil War having actually taken place in the 1640s between the armies of King Charles I, the Royalists, and the Parliamentarians, who were headed by Oliver Cromwell, it was the Parliamentarians who had won the war, and with a number of people actually blaming King Charles I, questionable decision-making and reckless spending habits for starting the war in the first place, Cromwell, on winning, declared that he was going to have the king publicly executed, which he did at 2 in the afternoon on the 30th of January 1649, outside of Banqueting House on Whitehall, which is still standing there. It's been there since 1619. We then, though, had 12 complicated years of English politics that followed that, but once we got to 1661, King Charles II, who was King Charles I's son, was able to take the throne back during what was known as the Restoration, and in doing so demanded revenge against Cromwell for what he'd done to his father. But there was a problem, and the problem was that Cromwell had died 2.5 years earlier on the 2nd of September 1658, and was buried inside the Lady Chapel of Henry VII at the back of Westminster Abbey. Not to be put off by a small detail like that though, King Charles II had an angry mob storm into Westminster Abbey, exhumed his rancid body from the ground, dragged him to Tyburn Gallows on Oxford Street, and then hanged him, even though he'd been dead for 2.5 years. They hanged his rotten body in chains there. When they finished with that, they brought him down. What was left of his head, chopped that off, dipped it in tar, stuck it on a big spike, and then joined the rest of the traitors here on the stone gatehouse of London Bridge, before then being moved to be displayed instead outside of Westminster Hall, where the Queen was lying in state fairly recently. That building has been there since 1097. His head stayed on display on the spike outside of Westminster Hall for 35 years afterwards as a horrible reminder of the horrors of the English Civil War. But in the meantime, there'd been another fire here on the bridge in 1633, but by that point the bridge was falling into disrepair. There were fewer people and fewer buildings here. It was nowhere near as damaging as the Great Fire of 1212. The bridge, though, stayed here in various states of disrepair right up until 1831, when it was finally decided that we needed to build a new bridge. But by 1831, there were 2.1 million people living in the City of London, and this was the main route across the river. So you couldn't just demolish the bridge and then make everybody wait for a new one. So instead, they kept the old bridge open while they built the new one there alongside it. Then, when that was finished, they rerouted the roads to go from the old bridge to the new one, which is actually more expensive than building the bridge in the first place. Then, when that was finished, demolished the old bridge, and so since 1831, it stood here on this site instead. But once we got to the 1960s, that one was then falling to bits, and so it was decided that we needed to build the bridge that we see today. But to build that was going to be surprisingly expensive, so the City of London came up with an interesting idea to offset some of the costs, and that interesting idea was to auction off the old bridge to the highest bidder, which seemed completely ridiculous. Who on earth was going to buy an 800-foot long, dilapidated stone Georgian bridge? Some guy did, a guy called Robert P. McCulloch. He paid £2.7 million for it, then over the course of the next 3 years spent £7 million more, painstakingly shipping it out brick by brick via California to Lake Havasu City in Arizona, where it currently stands right now, to this day, as a slightly bizarre tourist attraction. Some people say that the guy who bought the bridge actually thought he was buying Tower Bridge and not London Bridge, but that's absolutely an old wives' tale. He did know what he was doing, but weirdly enough, if he wanted to see the bridge that was standing here before this one in Victorian times, he'd now have to head out to Arizona to see it. Thanks for watching the video. Don't forget to leave a like, comment, subscribe, share this video with your friends, and you might like to watch this video next. I'll see you back here real soon for more walking history.